Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Nora Diemleitner, I'm the Dean of the Law School, and it's really my special pleasure to welcome you to the annual Hendricks Lecture in Law and History, which is ultimately put on by the Washington and Lee Center for Law and History. We are particularly fortunate today to have with us the person really responsible for getting us together, and this is our alumnus, and I mean the college's and the law school's alumnus, Pete Hendricks, and we're really delighted about this. Now, I do want to give you a little bit of information about the person who is responsible for today's lecture. Pete, as I mentioned, is an undergraduate alumnus, and surprise, nobody will be when I tell you he was a history major in the college, class of 1966, and then received his law degree in 1969 here. Now, Mr. Hendricks has built a very successful private practice in Atlanta where he specializes in land use zoning and government permitting. Now, for those of you who are not lawyers, and for some of our law students, these are areas of the law that require not only technical skill and expertise, but really rely heavily on negotiation skills and incredible political savvy. Despite all of his professional success, Mr. Hendricks has never forgotten his true academic love, which is history, I believe. He's a voracious reader of books of history, and several years ago, he endowed the Ollie Crenshaw Prize in History at the university in honor of his favorite professor. Needless to say, I think we're all very grateful to Professor Crenshaw for instilling this love of history in Mr. Hendricks. Now, today's lecture annually brings together both sides of our campus. Scholars who bring us together have made an incredible difference to the understanding of American history. And so today I'm really delighted to see not only so many colleagues from the law side in Stackhouse, but also the chair of the history department and other members of the undergraduate college. The person who will introduce today's speaker is Professor Jill Fraley, who is the director of the Center for Law and History. Now, this center is designed for the interdisciplinary study of law in historical context. So its goal really is to bring together scholars from WL and throughout the world to promote the research and teaching in all areas and periods of legal history. The Hendricks Lecture falls under the auspices of the center. Now, Professor Fraley, you will not be surprised, has a particular interest in legal history, and particularly has looked at the history of Appalachia and has authored insightful articles on the relationship between maps, law, space, jurisdiction, people, and natural resources. As a former environmental lawyer, natural resource law and land management are near and dear to her heart and inform many of her inquiries, many of which, in fact, involve historical understanding so that we can better explain the presence. In addition to her extensive scholarly work, Professor Fraley is also an award-winning teacher. It is my pleasure now to turn the podium over to Professor Fraley, who will introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor Michele Landis Dauber.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to see all of your faces in the audience at 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. I want to tell you a little bit about the background of our speaker, and to tell you just a tiny introduction to what she will be talking about. Now, the first thing that I want to say about Michele Landis Dauber is that I think she's someone who is very special in the current age of legal scholarship. It's currently an age of a technocratic approach to law. Law and economics and JD MBA programs proliferating. And in this world, Michele Landis Dauber is very rare because she has a very humanistic approach to history. I think that her writing perspective on her subject of law are really the kinds that are important to us because of that approach, because she is really interested in her flesh and blood fellow citizens. She's interested in poverty law, whether or not that is a sexy subject to us at the moment. She has a real passion for human stories and humanity itself in all of its endless variety. She comes to this passion and perspective through her own intellectual and experiential roots in Chicago, where she graduated from the School of Social Work at the University of Illinois, and that school named for the great humanitarian Jane Addams, and subsequently from Northwestern Law School. Professor Dauber earned a doctorate in sociology at Northwestern, the better to pursue her interests in sociology and law, cultural sociology, and the sociology of knowledge, constitutional law, and history. Though she's excelled in all of her scholarship naturally, perhaps her most recent is what has most profoundly shaped the field and made her mark, and that is the subject that she's also going to address today. Her research into the history of the United States as a welfare state has been nothing short of groundbreaking. She brings new ideas and a fresh perspective and to the debate on the future of our social safety nets and our obligations to one another as Americans. Her publications in this area most recently include her well-known book entitled The Sympathetic State, 2002. This book traces the history, the long history, of government disaster relief and its role in framing and defending the New Deal programs. And today, she is going to speak specifically about some of these issues in the history of disaster relief and kindly also tie them to some of our roots here in Virginia. Please welcome Professor Dauber.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that marvelous introduction. I'm really glad this is being taped so I can send that to my mother. And thank you to the donor for sponsoring this. I also want to thank the faculty of Washington and Lee University School of Law for inviting me to talk to you today about my recent book on the history of American disaster relief, which is entitled The Sympathetic State, like Professor Fraley said, and it is really an honor to present the Hendricks lecture. So the American welfare state is best known for being weak, cheap, and tardy. So how then are we to understand the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina when the Bush administration took a massive political hit for not taking enough responsibility for the suffering of Gulf Coast residents, or Hurricane Sandy, in which the House Republicans were very publicly taken to the woodshed by New Jersey Governor Chris Christie for their lack of generosity to its homeless and hungry victims. The U.S. government has spent more than $120 billion on rebuilding New Orleans, including over $14 billion in direct relief to individuals, and an even greater amount will be spent on Hurricane Sandy. George Bush, who was not known for his ability to admit errors, spent months doing acts of public penance, even going to rural Louisiana in the weeks after the hurricane to help build a house for a black family displaced by Katrina. And later, when Bush was asked by President Obama to head the relief effort following the Haitian earthquake, he was directly asked by journalists whether he saw that as a chance to atone for his failure in Katrina. Now, what's extraordinary about these examples is that it's usually completely safe politically to ignore the working poor residents of New Orleans and New Jersey, particularly for Republican politicians like Bush and Christie. But what about the millions of people who face overwhelming medical expenses, home foreclosures, skyrocketing consumer debt, plant closings, pension fund bankruptcies, outsourcing, declining returns to education, and the litany of other needs that you can read about in the daily paper? Nobody seems to be suffering any political consequences for failing to help those people. In fact, the Republican Party has built a dominant political position out of promoting austerity and criticizing any effort to spend federal dollars on human needs. And we need only observe the current effort by the Republicans to obstruct Obamacare and eliminate food stamps to see that public financial assistance for the needy is a deeply perilous matter for politicians, deciding which needs to meet and which needs to ignore is a very difficult needle to thread in the American context. And it is that kind of contrast between the generous response for disaster victims on the one hand and the chintzy response to the ordinary poor on the other that made me really want to understand the history of disaster relief and what makes it an outlier in the American context. So how did we get such a generous system of social provision for disaster victims in a country that generally doesn't have a very well-developed welfare state? Is it the difference that natural disasters are public, but man-made disasters are private? But that doesn't really seem right, because think about the billions of dollars that were paid to the relatives of September 11th victims. Or maybe it's just a question of scale. Katrina left hundreds of thousands of people without homes and jobs, and maybe we think the business cycle doesn't strike with the same kind of sudden, uncontrollable force. But this week is the 5th anniversary of the 2008 financial collapse, and it's clear that almost no one saw it coming, and people have been just as devastated by it in some areas as by any natural disaster. Or maybe we should distinguish between risk, which we could think of as being voluntarily undertaken in return for the possibility of gain, and a disaster, which is involuntary, maybe letting people suffer the consequences of their miscalculations in taking on an economic risk is necessary to get the benefits of free market discipline, but there's no social gain in allowing disaster victims to just endure the consequences of their misfortune. But we could multiply ad infinitum the cases of banks and auto manufacturers and insurance companies and other corporations that are receiving public subsidies to mitigate poor results. And it's not even clear that society as a whole is always best served by relieving disaster victims. An appreciable number of the homes on the Gulf Coast that were rebuilt with public dollars are going to be swept away in another hurricane. Ultimately, disaster itself is very hard to define. The question of which misfortunes are public and which misfortunes are private is a political question, not something that is inherent in the nature of things. But the stakes are high for figuring out which kind of thing you're having, as the contrast between the billions of dollars for Hurricane Sandy and the missing dollars for foreclosure modifications shows. And this insight that in America it's better to be a disaster victim than just part of the ordinary poor, it turns out is not a new idea. In fact, it's an idea with a long history. Although it's generally believed that there was no redistribution in the United States before the New Deal, except for veterans' pensions, this turns out not to be the case. So as I found when I began investigating, and as my book sets out in some detail, government disaster relief dates to the very first years of the Republic in the late 18th century. So very briefly, Congress began appropriating money for events like fires, floods, hurricanes, riots in the very first years of American government. Sometimes the early bills in Congress were for compensation for property owners. More often they were for general relief distribution. And by about 1820, private bills gave way to more general relief appropriations for classes of people, such as sufferers by fire at, insert the place, Alexandria, Virginia was one of the early ones. So during the late 19th century, this practice had escalated so that there were both more appropriations, around twice as many between 1860 and 1930 than during the 7 years leading up to that. And they were for a lot more money and a lot more people. There were several features of these early appropriations debates. So first, the recipients of federal aid had to be seen as blameless for whatever had caused their need. Second, what had been done before, and therefore might be done in the future, played a very big role in these debates. Discussion of precedent and fairness so that people were treated like the people who came before them dominated most of the congressional debate. And third, by the late 19th century, the constitutionality of these appropriations was completely settled. So there were occasional questions, usually for political or sectional reasons, particularly in the period leading up to the Civil War, but there was wide agreement that Congress had the constitutional power to spend in the general welfare under Article 2, Section 8 for you law students, and that Congress had, by its long practice, determined that relief for people poor through no fault of their own, and that's a key phrase, was indeed in the general welfare. And furthermore, there was also agreement that this determination was for Congress alone to make, so that if Congress got it wrong, the remedy was at the polls, not in court, and there was no judicial review of legislative determinations in this field. So this view that Congress had the unreviewable power to spend in the general welfare and that the general welfare included disaster relief was highly explicit and widely shared in Congress in legal briefs, in constitutional treatises of the time, and it was taught in nearly all U.S. law schools, particularly Columbia and Harvard, from which many of the New Deal's lawyers would later be drawn. The Supreme Court ultimately approved this idea in an 1896 case called Realty Company versus United States versus Realty Company. So, for example, the casebook used at Harvard to teach constitutional law at this time, which was James Parker Hall's Cases on the Constitution, noted that restrictions on the use of funds raised by taxation are relaxed, quote, in cases of great emergency, though not for the alleviation of ordinary poverty. While quoting extensively from Realty Company for the proposition that Congress had broad authority to spend for relief based on moral claims, even if no enumerated power was involved. Hall's constitutional law treatise also described Realty Company as authorizing an expansive congressional power to spend for moral obligations, and it included relief in cases of disaster among these moral obligations. And this power was, according to Willoughby's influential Principles of Constitutional Law, essentially unlimited, at least by the courts. Willoughby also cited Realty Company and quoted the Supreme Court there as saying, relying on the precedent of congressional appropriations for charitable relief following disasters, for its conclusion that generally the propriety of a spending decision, quote, must in its nature be one for Congress to decide for itself, quote, and was not subject to judicial review. Other treatises and law review articles followed suit. So as an illustration of exactly how insulated from review Congress thought it was when dealing with disaster relief, there were even fairly frequent calls in Congress and the courts to damn the Constitution, to the extent that there were any serious constitutional objections, which was not often, or as a way of disclaiming their own supposed constitutional objections. Senators and congressmen would routinely advert to a natural law theory of the state based on mercy or sympathy. So, for example, one congressman told the House following a flood on the Ohio River that, quote, mingled with the appeals that come to us for help are the cries of children and the petitions of women, homeless, shelterless, hungry, and in this presence I cannot stop to argue the literal construction of the Constitution, quote. Often congressmen and senators would admit that even if the appropriation was unconstitutional somehow, they would gladly vote for it and then fling themselves on the mercy of the people who they were sure would approve. Strict constructionists who had voted similarly in the past, such as Madison and Calhoun, were often resurrected for support. By the time Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1933, Congress had appropriated funds over 100 times for events like fires, floods, hurricanes, wars, and earthquakes. So during the late 19th century, for example, the federal government appropriated millions for relief following repeated Mississippi River floods. Well, given that we're at Washington and Lee, I thought I would digress for a minute and note that not every American lawyer and law professor was as sanguine about the implications of the general welfare power. Although professors at northern schools like Columbia, Harvard, and Princeton might treat Congress's unlimited power of the purse as a desirable, unproblematic feature of the legal and political landscape, at least one professor in the South saw the development of the general welfare power as insidious, oppressive, usurpation, dangerous to the nature of federalism, and this critic was John Randolph Tucker. He had been Attorney General of Virginia before the Civil War and had been a leading theorist of the legality of secession. He was elected to the House in 1875, and he remained there until 1887, where he was the chairman, the powerful chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And it was from that position that he repeatedly blocked efforts by the Senate to provide federal aid to education, and that, very interestingly, cost him his House seat. So even though he was the chairman of House Ways and Means, his district, which was here, actually rejected him and didn't return him to Congress because federal aid to education was very popular in Virginia. And after he was lost his election, he became dean and professor of constitutional law here at Washington and Lee, and was president of the ABA as well in 1894. So during his life and after, through the posthumous publication by his son Harry, on the right, of his treatise on the Constitution, Tucker argued vehemently for a narrow interpretation of the General Welfare Clause in which Congress could spend only for enumerated powers and subject to strict judicial review. And he opposed all federal spending, including for disaster relief. Tucker taught a number of students here at Washington and Lee on whom he had a very profound influence, and these students of his went on to become the lawyers who led the challenges against the Social Security Act and against the New Deal later, including John W. Davis, who's another of your famous alumni. So Tucker's position on the limits of congressional spending was unique among treatise authors of the time, and it was his view that the General Welfare Clause posed a very severe threat to whatever was left of states' rights after the Civil War. And on this point, he was not wrong, as the subsequent history of the New Deal and federal aid to education, I think, shows. During the New Deal era, Tucker's view of disaster relief, which was advocated by Harry and by his former students like Davis, was marginalized by the Supreme Court and then forgotten. So the common thread in this long history of federal spending for relief is what I call the disaster narrative. And this narrative characterized successful appeals to Congress for relief for the century and a half leading up to the New Deal. And it is still, I think, the predominant moral logic of the American welfare state. People seeking government aid needed to describe their own loss as the result of forces beyond their control for which they are not at fault and should be held blameless. And opponents of relief would usually argue the opposite, that this particular victim was in fact responsible for whatever had happened to them, and therefore didn't deserve any help, no matter how needy he or she might be. And I've described the American welfare state as the sympathetic state in order to get at what I think is its key characteristic. Generous government assistance for people who are in distress through no fault of their own, on the one hand, and no help at all for people who appear to be at fault for their own problems, even if their need is quite severe. The limits of the American welfare state are defined by the limits of the disaster narrative. So needs, even very severe needs that don't appear to be disasters, are simply ignored. Now, it's critical to understand that the boundary between blamelessness and fault is not fixed. To the contrary, there were lots of attempts throughout U.S. history to claim that the ordinary poor and the unemployed were also disaster victims, and therefore they should be treated with the same generosity as disaster victims. In the 19th century, these efforts to extend the idea of disaster relief to the ordinary poor were usually unsuccessful. At the time, the unemployed were a lot more likely to be seen as the victims of their own inherent vices, lazy, unwilling to work for the prevailing wage, rather than as the blameless victims of a widespread catastrophe. That view of unemployment prevailed until the New Deal in the 1930s. And at that point, President Roosevelt and members of his administration actually serendipitously rediscovered this long history of federal disaster relief, and they grasped the importance of these legal precedents, like Realty Company that I mentioned earlier, holding that Congress had the unreviewable power to spend to relieve disasters. So their problem was, how do we make this economic downturn into a disaster for which Congress can spend, unreviewed by the Supreme Court? And the New Dealers explicitly relied on these precedents and argued that all people in need of assistance during the Great Depression were the victims of a great national disaster and were therefore entitled to government help. And the government made this case in a variety of venues, in political speeches, in arguments to various levels of courts, including the Supreme Court, in briefs, in novels, in films, in photographs, in exhibitions, in plays. For example, New Dealers repeatedly called the Depression, quote, an economic earthquake, whose victims, chiefly the elderly and unemployed, were just as deserving of federal aid as victims of the natural variety. And this wasn't just hyperbole or a casual analogy. Casting the Depression as a disaster and, in fact, creating a singular capital G great, capital D depression that afflicted the entire country all at once was a very key part of the effort to secure political and legal support for the New Deal. And FDR himself was kind of a storm chaser. He frequently gave speeches at the site of floods, tornadoes, dust storms, and hurricanes. And this was actually following a 1936 tornado that took out basically the entire town of Gainesville, Georgia. And as he said in 1936, in the midst of a severe Western drought, quote, we no longer believe that human beings hit by flood, drought, unemployment, or any other national disaster should be left to the care of private charity or state and local governments, quote. Often he would compare the flood or the hurricane that he was speaking at to the Depression and tell the crowd, as he did here, to, quote, take a lesson about the role of the federal government in helping those in need through no fault of their own. And he ran for re-election in 1936 explicitly on a platform that included the rights of the people to federal aid to anyone, quote, overtaken by disaster. Roosevelt's relief captain, Harry Hopkins, said in a 1937 radio address, and this was as the Supreme Court was considering the constitutionality of the Social Security Act, and members of the administration had been sent out to do radio speeches and public addresses on this topic, said that New Deal programs for the unemployed weren't, quote, something new and revolutionary and frightful, but were entirely traditional, American assistance, quote, to help groups of citizens recover from disaster or other circumstances beyond their control, quote. Now I want to turn now in the time that I have left to discuss some examples of this argument from New Deal cultural productions, such as film and photography produced by the government itself in order to communicate its view of the economic collapse as a natural disaster to the American people. And one really important effort in this stream of cultural production was the documentary film, The River, and I'm going to show you just a 1.5 minute clip from the film very quickly, and then I'll talk about it after.
Food and water needed at Louisville, 500 dead, 5,000 ill. Food and water needed at Cincinnati. Food and medicine needed at Lawrenceburg. 55,000 homeless in Evansville. Food and medicine needed in Aurora. Food and medicine and shelter and clothing. 750,000 down in the valley. Last time we held the levee, but the Mississippi claimed her valley. She backed into Tennessee and Arkansas and Illinois and Missouri. She spread her arms over thousands of acres of land, and she left farms ruined, stock ground, houses torn loose. 1903, 1907, 1913, 1916, 1922, 1937. We built 100 cities and 1,000 towns, but at what a cost. Forcing more and more farmers into tenants. Today, 40% of all the farmers in the Great Valley are tenants. 10% are sharecroppers, down on their knees in the valley. A share of the crop of their own security. No home, no land of their own. Aimless, footloose, and in poverty. Unable to eat even for the land, because their cash crop is their only livelihood. Credit at the store, their only reserve. Facing a life of dirt and poverty, disease and drudgery. Growing up without proper medical care or schooling. Ill-clad, ill-housed, and ill-fed. And in the greatest river valley in the world.
Okay, so I want to draw your attention to two features of this clip. First of all, just to back up, this was produced by the New Deal's Farm Security Administration, and this film at the time it was made was the most commercially successful documentary of all time. It was probably the first commercially successful documentary. It was distributed by Paramount Pictures, and it was seen by literally millions of people. It was intended, quite self-consciously, to build support for various New Deal programs through an elaborate analogy between the Great Mississippi River Flood of 1937, which was the worst natural disaster in the history of the country at that time, and floods in general, and the Great Depression. So first, notice the fluid movement between the flood disaster and other social problems like farm tenancy and rural poverty. So the key characteristic of a disaster is not some quality of the event. It doesn't have to have natural origins, and even most natural disasters have a man-made causal component. But the quality of the victim's relation to it. So the people have been forced into tenancy, right? They didn't end up there on their own, and it was nothing that they did. They're there through no fault of their own. Now, second, although this is a film about the problems of the Deep South and of agricultural laborers, 70% of whom were African American, there are no black people anywhere in this movie. You can watch the whole movie, which is 25 minutes long, and you won't see a single black or brown face anywhere in it. Even the field hands picking cotton are all white women toting around adorable, fat, blonde babies. And the complete erasure of all black people from the Mississippi Delta in this film points us to an important fact that has ramifications for Katrina victims. The film seeks to highlight the blameless qualities of the floods and, by extension, the Depression's victims. And apparently white people made better candidates for blameless victimization at the hands of faith than black people. And there are other reasons that we could expect the Roosevelt administration to keep black people out of the film. He needed to hold Southern whites into his coalition and so forth. But white men are also missing from these images for the most part. Notice that there was no father in the scene of domesticity that I showed you at the end. And this suggests that blamelessness has components that have to do with both race and gender, a point that I'm going to come back to in a minute. I now want to look a little bit more closely at how the Depression was represented as a disaster in the 1930s, because I think it provides an important window into how the moral logic of disaster relief has entered into the practical politics of relief and financing. In the case of a depression, blaming an external event outside of the agency or control of the victim posed some very peculiar problems of documentation and imagery. So ordinarily, the qualities of the event itself help to establish it as a disaster: the height of the flood, the ferocity of the fire, the all-consuming power of the tornado, these events were clearly outside of the control of the victim, although their foreseeability is a potential source of difficulty. But the Depression, by contrast, was very hard to disentangle from its victims. How do you show unemployment without showing the individual unemployed person, or migration without showing the migrant, so that blame could be channeled away from the claimant? Images of the Depression always threaten to collapse into descriptions of need rather than blamelessness. And in America, unlike in European welfare states, which are constructed along other logics like citizenship, need is just as likely to provoke contempt as it is relief. So how do they solve that problem? And in addressing that problem, which is essentially one of representing the Depression as a disaster, proponents of the New Deal relied on two different methods, which I call aggregation and iconization. These strategies spanned legal briefs, political speeches, statistical surveys, photographs taken by administration staffers like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, documentary films like the one I just showed you, and writing by New Deal supporters and employees like John Steinbeck and members of the Federal Writers Project. Both of these techniques, aggregation and iconization, help to ensure that the individual unemployed very rarely came into sharp focus, which protected them against being blamed for their own problems. So aggregation subsumes people into a mass, for example, as statistics or photographic images of crowds. And the goal here is twofold. It makes the case for the sheer enormity of the problem, and second, it suggests that the deprivation is so widespread that it can't possibly be the fault of any one individual or group of people. And this leaves the victims blameless. So the first use of aggregation came even before the New Deal in Senator Robert La Follette's famous survey of economic conditions across the country. So La Follette was a well-known progressive senator from Wisconsin. And in December of 1930, he asked mayors across the country to send him information about local conditions, how many people were on relief in their communities. And he took those individual letters and he read them in Congress out loud, one after another, filling up hundreds of pages of the congressional record. And he depicted each response as just the local manifestation of some larger phenomenon. No story had to stand on its own, where it might be interrogated for some signal of complicity on the part of the claimants. Why haven't these people left and gone somewhere else where there is work, you might ask? Well, they couldn't, because he's reading all these letters from everywhere, giving the sense that the whole country is being affected. It was really mass suffering that he was interested in demonstrating. Now, from our modern perspective, where the collection of economic and unemployment statistics is just routine, this seems, like you could really miss the significance of what he was up to. In order to fully appreciate it, you have to understand that at the time La Follette undertook this survey, there were no unemployment statistics. In fact, La Follette only did this after President Hoover flatly refused to count the unemployed and count the people on relief, because the government admitted that it had no idea even how many people were unemployed anywhere in the country, presumably in order to avoid creating exactly the impression of a nationwide event that La Follette was after. And we can see the same effort to aggregate individuals, each with their own individual potentially discrediting story, into a mass of victims in the art and photography of the New Deal. So the most famous images of the Depression, including the ones that I'm going to show you, were produced by the Roosevelt administration through the historical section of the Resettlement Administration, which was later called the Farm Security Administration. And this was kind of a misleading series of names, but the head of the historical section was an economist from Columbia named Roy Stryker, who hired a staff of photographers and sent them out with shooting scripts specifying particular shots that he wanted or sociological themes that he wanted them to try to document. And Stryker himself in Washington reviewed every print that was taken, selected the negatives that would be printed, and then photographs that didn't meet his approval were killed. Literally, Stryker often punched a hole in the negatives of pictures that he thought were not going to help the administration. So as you look at these pictures, try to see the common strategy being expressed in these different media. So The photographic equivalents of labor statistics and surveys are images of crowds awaiting various sorts of relief: unemployment checks, bread, soup. The viewer is prevented from identifying the individual men by the hats, shadows, the hazy focus obscuring, particularizing details. So these are supposed to be people who are really equalized in their losses. And pictures like this point to a cause that is just necessarily larger than any particular person, and therefore very unlikely to be under anyone's direct control. So one man might be responsible for his own unemployment, but how could so many people be responsible for the economic distress which has hit each and every one of them? There must be something bigger at work here. So I want to turn now to the second strategy for narrating the Depression as a disaster, which I call iconization. Aggregation worked very well in constructing the Depression as a single massive event, an economic earthquake beyond the control of any one individual, but it was not very well suited to showing the blameless moral character of the victims. Having now constructed an event that's large enough to qualify as a disaster, the New Dealers had to portray its victims as individuals who were deserving of aid. Otherwise, the Depression might inspire awe at its scale, but not compel the kind of sympathetic federal response that would end up as monetary payments to shorten the length of those breadlines. But if showing individual loss was necessary, it was also dangerous for the reasons that I've already talked about, because these individuals might appear to be responsible for their own hard times, which would foreclose the possibility of relief, at least according to the precedents within which the New Dealers were trying to shoehorn their set of programs. And to forestall this threat, they produced images of individuals that were really shorn of their own biographies, leaving only the Depression itself as the cause for their deprivation. So this is the most successful example of this strategy at the time. I'm sure, how many of you have seen this picture before? It's pretty good, 70 years ago. The most successful example of this picture is Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother, and this picture came very quickly to be emblematic of the Great Depression. It's intended to immediately engage the viewer in the woman's suffering while discouraging any inquiry into any potentially discrediting information like family status, employment history, or any other details of her personal history. Lange's original caption for this photograph was, quote, "Destitute pea pickers in California, a 32-year-old mother of 7 children, father is a California native, February 1936. Now, even this sparse biography evidently offered too much potentially damaging information. 7 children? And they heard of family planning? Why do they have 7 children? Why isn't the father around? Why isn't he earning, more money? Okay, and Roy Stryker edited Lange's caption down to its present very stark simplicity. The administration gloried in this picture. It displayed it all over the country. The use of white mothers and babies, and preferably both, to invoke arguments about innocence from other domains was a leitmotif of the administration, and I have a few typical examples to show you from the archives. So scores of similar pictures featuring white women nursing, cradling, feeding babies. Oh, what just happened? Whoops. Ta-da! Okay, fill the archives. So, uh-oh. Doesn't seem to want to go back on. Let me start it. See if I can make it happen. There we go. Okay, so here's another one. This one's actually on the cover of my book. This photo was taken during the same 1937 Mississippi River flood that provided the backdrop for the film The River that I showed you earlier. It was Life magazine's Photo of the Year in 1937, and it won a number of awards. And it was also used by the American Red Cross in its fundraising appeals, and it was called Madonna of the Flood, which is obviously not a very subtle way to trade on these ideas about innocence. And this brings up an important point about the way arguments about innocence draw on pre-existing logics that are often rooted in gender and race, which I mentioned earlier about the film. So men weren't excluded from the New Deal's visual repertoire, but they did pose problems for the disaster narrative. Photographers were intentionally looking for subjects who could be protected against the collapse of need into fault or blame. And for this purpose, children, and particularly babies, were ideal. Men were very difficult because viewers might wonder whether these men were unwilling rather than unable to find work. Now, Lange tried to deal with this problem by appending page-length captions to her pictures of men describing their various efforts to find work and the ways in which they weren't at fault for their condition, usually due to disability or disease. And so if you go into the archives and you look at Dorothea Lange's original photos, you'll sometimes see captions that are a paragraph or even a page long. One common strategy used by photographers was to take a series of a family, some of which included the male members of the household, and then later to kill the pictures with the men in them and use only the pictures of the women and children for publicity purposes. And I have some examples of that. So this is an unprinted shot, and this is the printed one. And this is Walker Evans' photograph of a family that was featured in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and this is the printed shot. Let's see. And this is a Dorothea Lange shot, and this is the printed shot that was actually used as the cover of a John Steinbeck pamphlet about the migrants. So, race presented similar problems, and I mentioned in connection with the clip from the river, previously established logics of virtue and fault tend to cast suspicion on the moral status of needy African Americans. And this series illustrates a struggle with this difficulty. So this is, these pictures were taken by Ben Shahn in Illinois in 1938. This shot was killed, and this is the shot that was publicized. And now I have a series of pictures. These are also by Walker Evans. There's an interesting story about these pictures. Walker Evans and Edwin Locke were sent by the Farm Security Administration during the 1937 flood to take pictures, and it's clear when you read the correspondence between Evans and Locke and Stryker that the photographers were trying to document the different conditions in which black and white flood refugees were given relief, much worse conditions for African Americans. However, the administration killed almost all the negatives that Evans sent back featuring black subjects and instead sent photos of Harry Hopkins, who's this figure here. I quoted him earlier, sent pictures of Harry Hopkins standing with the white refugees out over the wire services to promote WPA relief efforts on behalf of the flood victims. And actually, this led to a dispute which caused Walker Evans to stop working for the government. Now, whites were easier to represent as blameless than blacks, whose imagined racial characteristics threatened to provide an alternative explanation for being on relief. And practically speaking, portraying blacks as the innocent and deserving victims of the Depression in the 1930s threatened to drive a wedge between Roosevelt and white Southern members of his Democratic coalition. Now, this evidence illustrates empirically what you probably already know from common sense, which is that African Americans stand in a somewhat problematic relationship to the sympathetic state. In America, one of the most consequential aspects of racism is that it's harder to represent black people as blameless than whites, and we saw a horrific illustration of this in the North Carolina shooting a couple of days ago of the young man who had had a car accident and showed up at someone's door, and everyone, including the woman who opened the door and the police officer who showed up and shot him 11 times, it made assumptions about blameworthiness in that context. So the characteristics that are assigned to blacks in the American racial ideology as lazy, irresponsible, criminal, undermine efforts to represent them as blameless victims in all but the most obvious circumstances, for example, in a hurricane. And given this difficulty, it's not surprising that the Roosevelt administration actively suppressed images of blacks from the public political defense of its relief and Social Security programs, even if it didn't suppress all black participation in the benefits of the programs. So the case for the blamelessness of the Depression's victims was not only made in photography, but also in literature, as I've said, in legal briefs. In the 1937 government brief defending the unemployment insurance provisions of the Social Security Act, the government lawyers argued that, quote, no informed person suggests that in the majority of cases, the individual worker loses his job through his own personal incapacity or dereliction. The loss comes to him as a disaster over which he has and can have no control. The disaster is not merely a personal misfortune, for when the breadwinner stops earning money, his family and ultimately society suffer, quote. And actually some pieces of that made it into the Supreme Court's opinion upholding the Unemployment Insurance Act. So I unfortunately don't have time to fully examine how the Roosevelt administration made the case for old age pensions. I can just talk about it very briefly. Obviously, old age poses a problem for would-be tellers of a disaster story because getting old is about the most foreseeable thing in life. People age slowly and inevitably, and they should save for that certainty. So what's regarded today as the centerpiece of the New Deal, the old age insurance program, was very, very difficult to justify as disaster relief. And the government knew, though, that it had to rely on these precedents to obtain political and legal support for Social Security, but it also knew that the analogy between disaster relief and old age was really fragile. So in a lot of different political statements, New Dealers, particularly President Roosevelt, concentrated not on the inevitability of aging, but on events that had turned growing old into a disaster, events that the elderly could not have foreseen. And these events ranged from the speed of urbanization, the extension of life expectancy, bank failures that had wiped out supposed savings, farm foreclosures, other factors that had combined unforeseeably to transform aging into a disastrous dependency. So President Roosevelt said in a 1934 speech, quote, old age is at once the most certain and for many people the most tragic of all hazards. There's no tragedy in growing old, but there is tragedy in growing old without means of support. So, for example, this photograph is entitled Old Age. It had one of Lange's very long captions, and it was Old Age, is of an elderly man living a dreadful life in a rundown shack, and it is an effort to capture Roosevelt's vision of aging. It was taken, like I said, by Lange during the 1936 presidential campaign under instructions from Stryker to document the plight of the elderly under the Depression and to highlight the value of the Social Security Act. And this is another similar picture. So there's plenty of evidence from Hurricane Katrina that times have not really changed all that much from the 1930s, at least in some ways. So for example, after Katrina, a number of people suggested that the people who had lost out had nobody but themselves to blame because they had failed to follow the evacuation order when instructed to do so. And on the other hand, there were some hopeful indications that sympathy for victims of Katrina may have brought down President Bush, may have helped to propel the first African-American president into office. So the important fact is that in moving circumstances across the line between private misfortune and public disaster, or vice versa, the key question is whether claimants can show that they've been victimized by fate and left needy through no fault of their own. In the American context, need alone, even very profound need, has never been sufficient to demand a public response. So the important question to answer is not whether the people seeking government assistance are needy, but why and who is to blame. Following the public disgust with the government's failure to aid Katrina victims was a nearly equal level of outrage at the government's decision to bail out corporations that were involved in the fiscal collapse. It was just clear to everyone that the big banks had brought their own problems upon themselves. And like Katrina, this reaction tended to cross party and ideological lines. Virtually everyone, from Michael Moore to Glenn Beck, seemed to agree that helping people whose fault it was violated some very basic clauses of the American social contract. These clauses require that the government come to the aid of those in need through no fault of their own, and also require that the government not help those whose problems are self-inflicted. So disasters, then, you might think of as the real third rail of American politics. Dangerous in the extreme, but a source of great power for those like President Roosevelt who can tap into them. And that's it. Thank you. I think we have a couple of minutes. I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
It would seem to me the Affordable Care Act would fit into that same narrative that this miracle is basic part that hasn't enough.
That's right. Yes, I agree. I think that you're absolutely right. So the question is, because this is being recorded, I'll just repeat it, is this why the Affordable Care Act is having so much political trouble? Because it's been discussed as a question of need rather, and these questions of blameworthiness have really been neglected in its political defense. And your mouth to God's ear. I agree completely. I think that there are lots of reasons for that. That have to do with the intervening years between the end of the Johnson presidency. I think Lyndon Johnson was sort of the last president we had who got this, and the present day. I think people have become overly technocratic and overly enamored of the idea of having sort of a European-style social democracy without really understanding the fundamental roots of the kind of redistribution that works in the American context. I also think some people have sort of general political opposition to that. When I've presented this speech to sort of policy people, not this work, it's not very empowering to present people as victims, And there is a sense of like, why don't we have a European-style social democracy where we just meet human needs because we should, and because it's a basic human right to medical care. And, my response to that is, yes, and, don't we want to do what's going to work, and what's going to be successful? And this is a, 230 years of success, in terms of how to build on a kind of a moral logic that people already agree with. And, but there is a trade-off, right? Because you are, to some extent, disempowering people by describing them as victims.
Would you characterize the Dodd-Frank Consumer Protection Act as similar to the Roosevelt administration's attempts to secure banks in 1980s?
Well, I think it is similar. I mean, in the sense that they tried to re-implement some aspects of it that were repealed, right? But much weaker. It's much weaker tea than the kinds of things that the Roosevelt administration tried. And I think that you can compare, the success that we're not having. In implementing it. Like the first regulations haven't even been rolled out yet because they've been stuck. The Roosevelt administration rolled stuff out, got it out there, did it with lightning speed. Dodd-Frank passed 3 years ago, and not a single regulation has yet gone into effect, and most haven't even been written yet. I heard a great thing on NPR about, it was an interview with the people who are saying, hey, we're never going to get these regulations out because the Club for Growth and these other organizations are suing and stopping every single regulation in its tracks and filing all these requests for information that are just tying the thing in knots. So, and even if it all happened, it would still be much weaker tea than the New Deal.
One of the things that occurred to me is that in the question I had, in the New Deal, a lot of that legislation that got passed was done when you had Southern Democrats chairing
That's right.
important committees, and everybody, I think, said, "Look, we ain't gonna bring race into this."
Right, that's right. I mentioned that briefly, but you're absolutely right. I have a whole chapter in the book about that, but which obviously can't do everything, but that's absolutely right. And in fact, there's an interesting story in the book about how the Committee on Economic Security, there was a big fight about whether unemployment would be a federal-state program or just a straight federal program, like old age insurance, and there were big advocates within the Roosevelt administration who really wanted a straight federal unemployment program. For anybody in here ever received unemployment or know how unemployment works? It varies wildly from state to state. Like, there's no minimum on benefits. Some states, I think Hawaii's $5 a week is your benefit. I mean, in other states, it's obviously much more than that. So it's just, you know, there's no federal uniformity. And so, and they saw that coming and wanted to have something like old age insurance. And they fought and fought and fought and fought. And it was a vicious fight, like a vicious political fight that went on and played out in the public. There were leaks to the press. I mean, it was horrible. And then when they got to committee, one of them wrote in a memo, like, I can't believe we wasted all that time fighting about this because these, you know, racist demagogues aren't going to let us get anything, basically. We're lucky to be getting what we're getting. And so, you're absolutely right about that fact. It's kind of overdetermined, but you know, that race needed to, that they needed to not have any pictures of black people getting federal relief, even though they were giving much more generous federal relief to African Americans than had ever been given in the history of the country. They suppressed images of it. So.
Do you think the New Deal's representation of mothers and children had like biblical origins from the extensive calling of the Bible to help?
I think that there's a kind of a chicken and an egg thing. I mean, there's stuff in the Bible to help prisoners and the condemned too, but I didn't see any pictures of that. So I think that, you know, I think that the fact that this idea resonates very deeply with people, you know, and that resonation feeds back into the political process. You know, people know what feels right to them and what seems right to them, and that comes from a variety of sources. It comes from the Bible, it comes from philosophy, it comes from all kinds of sources. And, you know, Roosevelt was a very canny sort of practical sociologist of the American public, and in fact, he and his wife both encouraged people to write letters to them, and I have a whole chapter in the book of letters that people wrote to the Roosevelts, a qualitative analysis of these letters, showing that people, when they thought that the government was thinking about giving them money, they told stories that were very long stories about how whatever happened to them wasn't their fault. And then I went into the census and found those people who wrote those letters, and a lot of what they said wasn't true, but they knew what kind of story they had to tell. Now, whether they knew that from the Bible or from Sunday school, or they were making educated guesses because they had read Mrs. Roosevelt's Ladies' Home Journal column, or, you know, it's really hard to know. But we have a very consistent, long-standing belief in American, you know, sort of culture that if it's not your fault, the government should help you. In fact, if we have an American sort of social contract at all, that's one of the key clauses, right? If it's not your fault, the government should have your back, as President Obama said during the Sandy, you know, aftermath. If it is your fault, you know, the hell with you. And, you know, so the key is showing that whatever's happened to you isn't your fault. And that's really important, and people will spend a lot of time and energy and effort to do that. And that's very unfortunate. I mean, we are one of the only states, probably the only state, that is organized that way. We have no floor of subsistence. If you caused it, you're on your own.
Following Katrina, I know some people criticize government-built levees for amplifying the flood. And so I'm wondering if back in the first part of the 20th century, whether people criticize the form of government help. Were people criticizing levees back then as sort of a questionable act of help?
No, people were all about progress, you know, and the levees were making it possible for people to farm in areas that it hadn't been possible to farm before. So there's a great book about this by John Barry about the 1927 Mississippi River flood that talks about, you know, how the levee system in the Mississippi Valley developed over time and how it actually ended up causing worse flooding ultimately because I mean, there's a lot of reasons, but from an engineering perspective, it causes deeper scour and increases the volume of crap that's basically being pulled along with the water. So when there is a flood, it's just really horrible. So that's by John Barry, B-A-R-R-I, is a great book about that. But the levee system was really popular because it allowed more access to arable land. And the land that was previously inundated wasn't inundated as frequently.
Have you studied or looked at all into the beginnings of U.S.
Yes, I have, as a matter of fact, and some of that's covered in the book. So one of the earliest ones was an earthquake in Caracas that shows up as a precedent over and over again. So the government started giving foreign disaster aid really early, like in the 18th century. And what happened was then when you have a domestic disaster, so then there was an 1812 earthquake in New Madrid, Missouri, and people were like, well, how can you give us less than you gave those people in Venezuela? You know, don't American citizens deserve the same kind of relief? So and then there was the famine relief for Russia, which basically was the dumping of U.S. surplus wheat in 1914, but that led to similar claims. So there really was very little distinction, even though there's a deep constitutional distinction, right, in the president's power to conduct foreign affairs. It never shows up. Like, no one ever stands up in Congress and says, oh, that's the foreign affairs power, that's different. It's a pretty hard thing to argue with. You gave millions of dollars to famine in Europe, and what about our own people starving at home? During the Cotton Depression, people used the wheat to Russia as a precedent. Pardon me? Right. But if you wanted to say, well, that was famine relief, and hey, half the South is starving, which half the South was starving due to the Cotton Depression in the 1917. So, that got mobilized very quickly.
Thank you all.
Oh, there was one more. Can we just? No, go ahead.
During your lecture, you talked about the element of blame in the hurricane.
Yes.
Now, looking forward to Hurricane Sandy, to me, it doesn't seem like that same element was there.
Right.
And so, what sort of things do you point to kind of blame that economy? Would you say composition of the perspective, or the composition of involved, or?
Well, I think race is an undeniable feature of it, but I also think that you had a Republican president in a Democratic city, right? And in the Katrina instance, and you have a Democratic president and a Republican state. So the political dynamic was somewhat different. I also think it's just the experience of the one carried forward to the other. Like, Obama was not going to screw this up. Like, notice he hasn't screwed up any disaster relief. Like, everybody knows that now, after Katrina, that way madness lies. And he has been, extremely good on disaster relief. And actually, this was a Clinton-Bush 1 difference, too. Bush 1, we've all forgotten this now, but there was Hurricane Andrew, which was a big screw-up in Florida. And people think that cost the first President Bush his re-election, and Bill Clinton was like Johnny on the spot every time there was a disaster. And there were all these floods along the Mississippi, actually northern part of the country, and he was, right there, and disaster relief was a really big deal. I think Bush treated FEMA very casually because he just didn't quite get it, and so when Katrina happened, they didn't have infrastructure. It also was the first, in fairness to George Bush, the second, that was a very serious situation that was very difficult to respond to. And, that was a mess, and it seems like, that would have been difficult for anybody to do. He certainly didn't help himself with, like, you're doing a heck of a job and, seeming like he was not caring about it. But, it's really hard to say it's just race, but I definitely think that played an important role